Hi everyone, welcome to a new session of Cut the Noise. We have with us Shraddha Bhandari, who is a geopolitical expert and is going to help us talk through and understand what's happening in Israel with the recent Hamas attack and the impact that it has on the global economy, as well as what the impact that it may have on you as an investor.
Absolutely. No, thank you for inviting me. This is how a geopolitical analyst space looks after a week of intense happenings in the region. But yeah, it's tough times for everybody. You know, personally, we have friends in Israel. We know Palestinians. So besides the numbers of casualties, the analysis we're doing, it's very painful. It's like it's so close to home. So yeah, I mean, it's been quite a roller coaster week.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I think the same situation everywhere. The fact is, we're not only dealing with casualties or events in Israel, but also events impacting Jews across the world. And we'll talk more about that. But that's the headline that's captured every single newspaper, every single social media. And we wanted to see how we can use your expertise to break down some of these events for our users and also talk about potential implications as they think about their portfolios or they think about future events. Just like to begin by introducing you formally for everyone. Shraddha is an international expert on geostrategical intelligence and social political risks. She has worked across Fortune 500 companies, startups, governments, and world-class universities. She's currently the CEO and founder of a management consulting firm based in Dubai called Confluence Consultants. The company focuses on advising clients on navigating markets in situations exactly like this. And these companies are based either in Southeast Asia, Middle East, or Africa. Her work entails analyzing risks associated with politics, policy regulations, geopolitical trends, supply chain disruptions, and business continuity. Prior to this, she was the head of the intelligence team for Barclays Bank Asia Pacific and responsible for analyzing threats to geopolitical or security risks and their impact on operations for the bank. As I mentioned, she's had a hectic week. She's been a sought-after guest speaker at Harvard, at the Overseas Security Advisory Council, and several conferences in the Middle East where she's based. Thanks again, Shraddha, for taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
I'm going to begin by asking a question which probably will require a day-long session, but not beginning with the history will not put enough context to the conversation. If you could help summarize or throw a light at a very high level of what has got us here. This is an area or a region that has been in conflict for decades. And it isn't that this event suddenly transpired overnight. What, in your view, has got us to this point where Hamas took such a dramatic action of bringing a large force of terrorists into Israel?
I think, Nikhil, it would probably take a month, but I could start from where Hamas was formed in 1987. But I think the roots are way much in history. So I'll just cap out the main events for the purpose of the audience listening in and what happened in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Just starting from 1947 when the peace plan was formed, 1948 when the state of Israel was declared, and then the first Arab-Israeli war ensued. Post that, the entire region was divided into three parts. There was Israel. There was the West Bank, which was under the occupation of, or which was controlled by Jordan, and Gaza, which was controlled by Egypt. 56, Suez Canal crisis, Israel invades the Sinai Peninsula, which was with Egypt. Then you'll go on, then there are skirmishes, tensions build up. Syria, Jordan, Egypt together form an alliance to combat the Israelis. The 67 Six-Day War where Israel took over West Bank, Gaza, to add it to its territory. And then what we've been hearing in the news quite a bit, the Yom Kippur War. So 50 years of Yom Kippur War was when Egypt and Syria did a surprise two-front attack on Israel. Did not lead to much change in the status quo, but they started negotiating on the treaties that each of them had. 1979, the Camp David Accord, which essentially established peace between Egypt and Israel. Camp David Accords, then what happened was 80s, tensions was arising. It's very similar to what's happening today. So nations around the region were normalizing relations, but the Palestinian question was left out of the picture. So you were negotiating in Israel-Palestine, but there were no Palestinians, right? So 1987 was when the first jolt came to Israel in the form of the Intifada. Intifada is nothing but a popular Palestinian uprising in both the territories of Gaza and West Bank. which really shook Israel by surprise. They challenged the Israeli military. There were essentially popular uprisings by people. And that continued for a number of years till 1993 when the Oslo Accords were signed. After that, the peace treaty and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was doing its own things in the meantime. They were in Lebanon and they would fire rockets from across the border, which led Israel to invade Lebanon in 1982. So the entire area was caught within this conflict. Then the second Intifada was 2000, even more bloodier than the 1987 Intifada. 2006 was when the Intifada ended and democratic elections. So Israel basically withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And there were elections held in which Hamas won with a very decisive majority. That was a split in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was till now the united body that was leading the Palestinian liberation. And Yasser Arafat, who was the pioneer and founder, passed away in 2004. It's not that Israel wasn't doing anything to provoke. So 2014 was quite a bloody year. 2018 was when a number of popular protests once again started from the Gaza Strip side against the Israelis. In midst of that, everybody was trying to mediate. So from, I think, 2008 to now, there have been 7 failed attempts of mediation. So everybody's signed agreements, but nobody really keeps up to it. And then I think the roots of this were really sown in 2018 when President Donald Trump came to power. Right. So he had made an Israeli-Palestinian peace process the cornerstone of his foreign policy, but he didn't want to do it the conventional way. He moved the embassy of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, unilaterally sanctioned the settlements that are happening in West Bank, etc., by the Israeli settlers. And at the same time, he encouraged Arab countries, especially the ones like United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, their rapprochement with Israel, which led to the Abraham Accords in 2020. This was what was happening in the international sphere. Internally, there were 2 things happening in Israel. Israel has been facing a political crisis for the last couple of years. They've had about 5 elections in almost 4 years. Every time there was a brief period when all the opposition parties united against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the prime minister at the moment, and he's the head of an extremely right-wing party called the Likud party. But other than that, the governments kept becoming more and more hardline. The current government of President Benjamin Netanyahu that came to power last year has ultra-nationalist factions. I mean, it's never been... So Israel has always had a functioning democracy. You could call it exclusivist, etc., but they've always had a running parliament. They've got, in the Knesset, there's always been a 20-21% representation of the Arab parties. So they had their own democracy in form. This new government has 2 new parties called the Zionism Political Power and another right-wing faction. They're related to the settler movement in West Bank. So they took a lot of concessions from the Netanyahu government to form this coalition. And I think a lot of the issues began then. Israel also thought that the international environment is changing. There is now no support for Islamic-backed groups, for example, so they could operate with impunity. So I think one of the major things that happened in the last 2 years has been increased settlements, not around Gaza, but West Bank, which had sort of made its peace with Israel. So they've been settling people in West Bank. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is what the Al-Aqsa flood operation of Hamas is, it's the 3rd holiest shrine for the Muslims around the world. And very interestingly, when I went to Israel, they shared, so the holiest place of the Jews and the holiest place of 3rd holiest place, they share a compound, right? And very few people know this, but the Al-Aqsa compound is administered by the Jordanians. And so on the Israeli side, they started stopping Palestinian people who wanted to come and pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In 2021, I think they entered the mosque and there were protests around it. They used stun guns, etc. So a lot of resentment was building up. And I think in the middle of all of that, the Saudi-Israel normalization process came, which would have absolutely cut Hamas out of the entire equation. It would have really weakened the Hezbollah. I think this was last year when we were having a conversation with a client here, and we said that, this entire area is moving towards stabilization. And when it's moving towards stabilization, you should be ready for a backlash. So I think people are saying that, it was an alleged intelligence failure. We don't know what happened, but it probably was the Israelis believing that Hamas is on its last leg or that they would not dare to do it. And they're more interested in sort of gaining hold on Gaza as the world climate changes. So, here we are, quite a reset in what's been happening. So a lot of people were very confident for this region that it's moving in the right direction towards a rapprochement, and a lot of that has now been challenged.
I now understand why you said it'll take a month to discuss this topic. But if I was to summarize it in the way I understand, it's been an incredibly conflict-prone region because of the different religious lines that were drawn. There's also been constant battle for land and settlement across Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. And probably, while a lot of one of the things that I think a lot of people probably did not know is that Hamas is actually the politically appointed party for the Gaza Strip. This is not a terrorist organization which is without political power, as would happen in most parts of the world. And I think one of the most interesting things that you said is that with the buildup of support for Israel or treaties with the rest of the Arab world, as well as support from the US and other Western powers, it felt that the Hamas felt cornered and almost thought it was a last opportunity to lash out or to bring attention back to their cause.
Absolutely. And there's also the proxy conflict angle. This is Russia has a stake, China has a stake, US has a stake. So it's a very, very complicated conflict in that sense.
I want to come back to that, but I do want to, one of the other headlines that have been capturing news, at least for the last 48 hours, is around the protests that are happening in France, in Western Europe, and in universities, including Harvard, Columbia, across the United States, where people in large numbers, Arab nationals, are protesting against Israel and calling somewhere Hamas's actions justified. And these are not just Palestinians. As you see on video, there are people flying the Abu Dhabi flag or that of other countries. And wanted your perspective on how this crisis may be beyond just the Gaza Strip, and how Arabs across this seem to be united in the cause against Israel.
It's always been a conflict outside of the Gaza Strip. When the Palestinian question was gaining ground, President Nasser of Egypt led a pan-Arabism movement, right? The cornerstone of all of that in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s to unite the Arabs was the Palestinian cause. So it's always had sort of pan-Arabic connotations. There's a very interesting book called The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda's Road to 9/11. Which basically postulates why Israel was an existential crisis in the region, right? So when Israel was formed, it was an era of modernism in a lot of Arab countries. Before it was formed, Egypt was undergoing modernization trends. Iran was undergoing modernization trends. And then Israel was formed, and they single-handedly defeated the Arab nations. So there was a setback, and there was a belief that because these Arab countries had gone away from religion and from their brethren around the world, is because this happened. So a lot of them decided that it was important to bind together, it was important to bind towards religion, and that stayed on, at least in this region. But I would just point out, if you see the protests, there's been protests all through the Palestinian issue across. But if you see today, as of now, because the ground invasion has not begun, the protests are in southern Lebanon, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. They're happening in Jordan, which is about a massive amount of Palestinians are settled in Jordan. Egypt has seen some bit of it. There has been obviously Iran, Iraq, which are again very closely intertwined. I've not seen anything yet in the GCC. I've not seen anything in Saudi Arabia. I've not seen UAE. I've not seen anything in Bahrain. So the entire GCC, Qatar is often affiliated with terror groups in the region. I've not seen anything there. Turkey, there have been protests, but that's because Turkey is the wild card in all of this. It's a power which is looking to come back into the Arab politics. And for them, the Palestinian causes might serve the purpose. France, US, India. I mean, I'll share my experience with you. When I was in the university, I was completely pro the Palestinians, right? It's an underdog story that's often repeated. It appeals to the universities around the world. Suppose somebody gave me this example when I asked them, why do you support the Palestinian cause? They're like, it's like I come in your home, I throw you out. And then when you ask me why you're doing that, I will start throwing bullets at you. This is the analogy, which is very misleading because that's not how it happened. But I can understand what the charm is. There's also a difference in age group of who supports Israel and who supports Palestine. So you'll find young people generally pro-Palestine. So in the Harvard case, for example, the Students' Union wrote that, but all of the adults of Harvard alumni wanted them to retract it. There is also the angle of countries that have faced terrorism. So you will find India mostly in favor of Israel. the problem also is that the entire region is looked from the lens of religion, right? So it is not Muslim versus Jews only. There is land, there is, like you said, there is politics, there are proxy conflicts, there is how the regions have been using Palestine as a foreign policy. But it's much easier to simplify it. So I'm guessing the protests are a reason of that. In the past, they've been able to influence policy towards Israel of a number of countries. Let's see how this time pans out, because the clout and the power is now with the GCC countries.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's complicated, and I think what you've referred to a few times in the few answers before is around proxy wars and the potential of other countries getting involved. Many countries have come out in support of Israel. A few countries, including Russia, have come out in support of the Palestinians. Do you see this, or is there a potential for this, and maybe on a probability scale, of becoming a larger conflict within the region, within the European region, or do you think this stays maybe a prolonged war, but between Israel, Hamas, and maybe Lebanon?
There's a very big Indian commander who once said that it's very easy to start wars, difficult to sustain them, and notoriously hard to stop them. Right? So we don't know how it's going to pan out in what way. All I'll say is, generally what we do is a very simplified version of game theory to politics. So we look at the actors and we try and analyze what the motivations could be: a limited war, a more sort of second front opening, and then a regional configuration. So from a very simple perspective, the countries or the actors that want escalation are, of course, Israel. Hamas wants an escalation. Iran, to a certain extent, yes. So these are the main actors who would want an escalation. Even Russia and China, who have come out in support of the Palestinian cause, will not be able to afford a complete escalation in the area. The countries that don't want escalation, UAE tops it. They were the first ones who started all of the normalization process with Israel. It's COP28 here in Dubai, where, like, for the first time, a number of, like, they've never hosted this sort of gentry in the city. Saudi Arabia absolutely does not want any escalation. Their Neom city is just around the border from Israel. So I know they're freaking out. I've been getting calls from clients, should we visit Neom city, etc., etc. The GCC, I think, is not in favor. Egypt is not in a position economically to support any escalation of the conflict. And then there are obviously people whose motivations are still, we're trying to understand. The American motivation, I think people are still contemplating. Some of them are saying this has been done by the Americans so that they can come back to the Middle East. Some are saying this is the last American war because they've not been able to But from my perspective, I think invasion in Gaza is imminent. That's 100% probability. Israel will do something. It's already started the aerial bombardments, etc. Once it enters, it's not an army that's equally good in urban warfare. They've not really done urban warfare in a number of years. So it'll get protracted, it'll get bloody. If there are too many Gazans dying, that might force the other Arab countries to take a stand. But from now on, I mean, I think even a second front, unless Israel substantially weakens in Gaza, Hezbollah will think twice. They're very good they've got an arsenal about 150,000 rockets. They're very, very good at shooting rockets and disrupting. They cannot draw Israeli army into Lebanon. It's happened before. It's not ended well for anybody. And the other groups that are they talking about who will join in the conflict, so it's the Iran-backed Iraqi groups. Then there is obviously the Hezbollah fighters in Syria and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. But having said that, it all depends on the public opinion. If the public opinion turns against their Arab monarchies or against the peace processes, so that is something that will need to be monitored. So we tell all our clients that there's an escalation chart that we have, in which we're monitoring Yemen, we're monitoring Syria, we're monitoring Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. What will happen in these areas will end up determining everybody else's. But as of now, I don't think it's in anybody's interest to escalate the conflict, including the Russians and the Chinese. To me, it seems like the Americans have come out so strongly in favor of Israel. That's not happened in a number of years. It's always been tempered. Yes, we support you, but you need to figure out the Palestinian problem. It's all Israel this time. And it seems like a gauntlet to the Chinese. You wanted to become the security broker in this region. You wanted to broker deals. Now, come on, let's see how well you can do it.
And Shraddha, that was going to be my next question. This is a region, obviously, which exports tremendous amount of oil, natural gas, very critical elements which going to exist in the region. and we've all seen what happened 18 months back when the Russia-Ukraine conflict happened, what it did to inflation and global sentiment. How are you seeing, what I took away from your last answer was that it is unlikely that conflict escalates beyond this region. Everyone has their own motivations, and in a lot of cases, because of history, there is unlikely to be that escalation. But a lot of these are GCC countries, part of the OPEC. How do you see them participating, and how do you see the impact to supply chain, especially on the oil side?
Two things. Obviously, the energy prices spiked up because speculatory fear always plays in. Immediately, there's a conflict. Israel is not a major exporter just yet, although their Eastern Mediterranean reserves are actually quite big. So the Chevron-operated Tamar natural gas field has been shut down. It was increasing its natural gas production to Egypt and Jordan. So, the deal is the world is really tight in terms of energy supplies at the moment. The Russian energy supplies have massively declined. So everybody is rushing around, and a sort of equilibrium had come about in terms of who gets energy from what. And so last year, for example, you had the real price of energy, then you had the price cap price of energy that the Russian sanctions had imposed, then you had a shadow market that had sort of started to settle in. Now, all of that has been again thrown into the open. So one is obviously the Eastern Mediterranean, but that's a little in the future because of the conflicts in the region, they're just being narrowed down at the moment. The West has, in the wake of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, signed a lot of natural gas deals with Qatar. They're a country that has massive natural gas. So I was in Qatar very recently for quite a bit of time, and I see a changed Qatar. So the lure is one side, the foreign policy that they've been following for so many years of keeping a tab on conflicts in the region. So they have a stake in Iraq, and they have a stake in Syria and everywhere. And then all of these big deals that Western companies are signing with them, a huge amount of money is pouring in, and also the carrot of the free trade deal with Europe. So Qatar will be interesting to watch. Immediately, I think, unless it reaches Iran, which is a major crude oil supplier at the moment, India is relatively safe in that sense because India had about 16 billion that it used to import. That's come down to almost 600 million. But it is supplying to China, for example. So if that gets disrupted, China will need to get energy from somewhere else, which means that the market prices will shoot up. But other than that, in the short term, I think it'll be speculatory pressure. And if it becomes a region-wide conflict, then yes, we have quite a power keg on our hands.
How do you see? You've talked about the energy dependence that India has on the region, but do you see any other role that India is playing as a country, or any other direct correlation that India has to this conflict playing out politically, socially, even within the country? The Prime Minister yesterday announced more security for Israel assets in the country. But do you see any other changes that directly impact India or people staying in the country?
Absolutely. I think from a very basic level, Indian companies have exposure to Israel. Obviously, not in the terms of it being a game changer, not like China or the US, but infrastructure, IT, pharma are big companies. So obviously, Adani owns the Haifa port. That's a more well-known bit of it, but that's not a very big portion of their sort of moving around supplies, etc. We've collaborated with a lot of pharmaceutical companies here in the region. For example, India is engaged with a lot of Israeli initiatives. So the I2U2, for example, India, UAE, Israel, and the US. So there is exposure in that sense. Defense is one area which will be interesting to watch because as of now, Israel is our third largest defense exporter. We get about 8% from them, but there was an increasing sort of bilateral talks happening that we increase defense purchases from them in the wake of decreasing our dependence on Russia. So that will now have to be rethought because Israel is not going to be able to divert its resources anytime in the future, similar to the Russian situation. So India's defense strategy will now sort of need a rethink. There is this also about our power projection, right? So India has presented itself as a leader as a sustainable, sensible leader of Global South that's not looking to promote conflicts anywhere. So the recent G20, the IMEC, the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor Agreement was signed. I think just the major thing is going to be how do we handle our relations with the countries here. There has been a reset, definitely. We were promoting economic deals with for example, there was talks about India, UAE, and the larger Middle East. technology corridor, defense corridor, pharma corridor. Security has come back into the center stage of this region. And when security is involved, people look at countries like Russia, China, and the US. So India will have to carve out its own. A lot of people have said that because it's neutral, it can talk to both the Israelis and the Palestinians, like it could talk to Israel and Ukraine. It can use that leverage. But when you compare it to the leverage of the other nations, US controls the military choke point. The Russians are involved in so many conflicts. The Chinese control the economic choke point. We have to find another leverage. We can. It's just something that the policy will have to focus on.
Understood. No, thank you for this. Clearly, there are just so many moving parts and so many variables involved, which, it's not it looks, I don't want to use the word simple, but it is far beyond just an Israel-Hamas conflict. It is far beyond what has transpired in the last 10 days and has, has decades of history going back to 1950s. But thank you for breaking this down and giving us perspective on some of these events. I almost feel like we need to get you back every few weeks as the situation evolves, because I think it will evolve and we'll see new things come into play. But I think this was incredibly helpful. Thank you for taking the time. And the one piece that I'd like to leave for anyone listening in is that events like this do bring a tremendous amount of uncertainty for investments. It becomes harder and harder to predict how some of these will play out into returns or future projections of returns. I think it is difficult to say this asset class is better than that asset class. The one consistent advice that I have heard over the last 1 week from investment advisors is to really look at diversification and making sure that you are investing as much as you can potentially take comfortable risk on. This is not the time to be over leveraged or to think about risk beyond what you can normally take, because there are variables at play which none of us can necessarily predict or control.
Absolutely. And I will just add one more thing to that. Terror attacks of this sort tend to generate copycats. So the Indian intelligence, the French intelligence, everybody is on high alert. Because it may be just rogue elements deciding to emulate what Hamas has done, and that's been the trend. So that's something that India also has to be very careful about. And I'm going to stop now.
No, once again, thank you. And you're absolutely right. I think it's a time for all of us to be watchful as countries and as investors about what plays out. But really appreciate you taking the time. This was very helpful. And I hope for everyone listening in, this was an insightful session. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we coordinate with each other to get you more details. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Investments in debt securities are subject to risks. Read all the offer-related documents carefully.